Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on the Evolved Work Week and navigating the 4-day week. Hopefully you can hear and see us. If somebody could let us know in the chat that we are all live and that everything is going smoothly, because we've had a few technical difficulties in the past. So I just want to make sure that you can definitely hear and see us. Hopefully, yes, amazing. Thank you very much, Annalise. So yes, welcome. If you haven't been to one of our webinars before, I'm Molly. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of Flexer, which is the platform that enables people to search by how they want to work as well as what they want to do. And we enable companies to get discovered for their amazing working environments and EVPs as well. So obviously it's quite a topical webinar in terms of what people want and how people are working, to talk about the Evolved Work Week, which we will dive into in much more detail with somebody who's even more of an expert on this topic than I am. So Joe, pleasure to have you here, and it'd be lovely if you could introduce yourself.
Sure, pleasure to be here, Molly. Thanks for the intro. My name is Joe O'Connor. I'm the CEO and co-founder of an organization called Work Time Reduction. We are based in Canada, but operate globally. And we're a consulting and research organization specializing in the shorter work week, but also more generally helping companies, teams, and people to work less and to get more done. I've spent most of the past 5 or 6 years of my career leading global research projects and pilot programs of the 4-day week and other evolved work week modalities. So really looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And just briefly, in terms of kind of a bit of housekeeping and how we'll be running this. So the first kind of 35-40 minutes, we will be discussing between Joe and myself a few different topics around how you can implement the 4-day work week or 4.5-day week or 9-day fortnight, any form of evolved work week, why it's so important, and also, try and answer some questions of yours at the end. So we'll leave at least 20 minutes, as I know that there are a lot of people here today that are very interested in, how do you make a business case for this? How do you measure the impacts of it? Because I think for a lot of companies that are maybe even struggling to adopt normal flexibility in the 5-day work week, it might feel like a bit of a jump. In terms of questions, there is a kind of little question box. If you could pop your questions in there. So on the right hand side where that chat is, there's a Q&A toggle. So if you put your questions in there throughout the discussion that we're having, if anything springs to mind, then I will come to them afterwards. And we will spend kind of 20 minutes answering your questions at the end. Feel free to use the chat box to comment on things, or say if you agree or disagree at any point. We want to make this as discursive and interactive as possible. So to kick off, I think the most important question in order to frame the discussion that we're having is, really what is the definition of an evolved work week or a 4-day week? We can focus on 4-day week first.
Sure. So my definition would be that we're talking about a genuine reduction in hours for the same salary, but with an expectation to produce the same or better outcomes. So often I find that to some extent the 4-day work week is almost a victim of its own success, because a lot of the coverage focuses on the outcome and not on the process. But when we think about the process, what we're really talking about is as much about changing the way that people work as it is about changing the number of hours that people spend at work. So this is fundamentally a work redesign initiative, an operational excellence initiative, and it really requires people to think differently about their processes, their work practices, and their own personal and team productivity in order to find those efficiencies that are needed in order to make it work.
And when when we talk about the 4-day week, that reduction in hours, what different patterns and ways of doing that have you seen?
So I would say the most common there's the most straightforward, obvious one, which is everyone has a universal scheduled day off, most commonly Fridays. And often when people think about the 4-day work week, that's where their mind arrives at. But if you take the recent UK trial that I was involved in with 61 organizations, less than half adopted a model where everyone had the same day off. It's also common to have some form of split shifts or rosters for organizations who need to maintain service coverage right the way through a 5-day work week, and in some cases even a 6 or a 7-day schedule. And then there's also organizations that adopt differentiated design models, where maybe for some departments or some teams, they might have a universal day off, and for other more front-facing, customer service-facing teams, they might have a different solution. So I think that the core truth is that this is something that's not one size fits all, and it really needs
Yeah.
to be customized based on the needs of the organization and, where possible, the preferences of individual employees as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I guess from all of the research that you've seen and all the different companies doing it in different ways, have you landed on a sort of best way of doing it for the majority, or is it really, depends on the organization?
I think that it's a mistake to kind of look at the way one other organization has done it and say that's the right
That's the
way.
best
There
way.
isn't
Yeah.
one right way, and it really does need to be custom designed for the organization itself. I've seen
Yeah.
lots of companies who have, jumped in at this because it's in the media, or they've seen a competitor do it, and they often might end up winding back the original design because they haven't gone through that iterative process of thinking it through and really involving their employees with that process as well. For this to be something that is not just successful but actually sustainable in the long run, I think it needs to be a bottom up process, and it needs to really involve, not just attacking the obvious inefficiencies, and I'm sure
Yeah.
we'll get the opportunity to discuss some of those, but also really involving people in this process of uncovering some of the more some of the less obvious ones. And I think one of the fascinating things about this as a concept is that, compared to most other change management initiatives, I think that if you structure this in the right way, you get a remarkable degree of honesty and buy-in and engagement from employees to the process of figuring out where are the frustrations, where are the little things that maybe we could do a little bit better, because it's such a powerful incentive. The benefit and the reward at the end of this, if you get it right, is genuinely life-changing and transformative for people. So you really need to leverage that in the way that you approach this.
Yeah, I can imagine it's not really going to be a change that can happen overnight. So you mentioned there about the right kind of process to go to kind of start to move into a 4-day week and involving your employees. I think our audience would love to hear a bit more about what that process. Obviously, it's probably going to vary from organization to organization, industry to industry. But what process would you advise that people go through if they're thinking maybe the 4-day week is something that we'd like to trial?
Sure. So typically we start, when we work with organizations, with a discovery or a diagnostic phase, which is almost like a feasibility study to assess the readiness, the
Yeah.
capacity to reduce work time without impacting overall business outcomes. And that's looking at and assessing the pros and cons of different structures and different models, like some of those variations that we just talked about. So stress testing those in different areas, almost conducting a pre-mortem where you're trying to think through, if we were to do this and it was going to go wrong, how might it fail? And therefore, how might we mitigate or avoid some of those potential points of failure? And really using that to identify where are the challenges and the barriers, but also where are the opportunities for improvements? Where are the things that really, if we were to move towards a shorter work week, we could really find efficiencies in these areas. We're then talking about a structured planning period. And the key thing is, we would always advise, by the time you flick the light switch and you're moving to your 4-day week or your 9-day fortnight or whatever that might look like, to a very significant extent, your people have already figured out how to operationalize this in that kind of lead-in period. They've started to make those changes, and so it should be a much more smooth, seamless experience. I've seen organizations make it work where it's been much more, overnight. But I would say that typically it tends to be a little bit more of a bumpy, chaotic transition where, they're building the aircraft while it's in flight. They might eventually figure it out, but it's maybe not going to be as seamless an experience as it could have been.
Yeah, really interesting. I think the smaller organizations probably can go into it a bit more overnight. There's kind of less organizational transformation, whereas I can imagine for the bigger companies that you've worked with and observed and researched, it must be a bit more of a kind of effort in transition.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
The bigger the organization, typically you're going to have more complexity. You're going to have a less flat structure. You're going to have maybe a more bureaucratic decision-making process in terms of moving through the different phases. So even if you take, when I started working with companies on this about 5 years ago, the typical 4-day week or shorter work week company was probably somewhere between 20 and 50 people. I would say our average client today is more like 150 to 300 kind of headcount. But then when you talk about major global brands, so organizations with tens of thousands of employees, typically the pilot group that they start with is still no bigger than 150 to 300 employees. So they're much more likely to take that approach of, we'll test it out in one area, we'll learn from that, we'll iterate, and we'll expand outwards. And it kind of means from a business perspective, you're minimizing the blast radius if something goes wrong.
Yeah, exactly. That sort of damage mitigation and proving that it does or doesn't work for that organization in a smaller setting. And you mentioned the 9-day fortnight there, and obviously also there's the 4.5-day week. I thought it's worth paying a bit of attention to those kind of different versions of reduced working hours within the week, because when we launched Flexa and started as a, gosh, what were we? 4 or 5 person company, we basically started immediately with a 4.5-day week, because I'd always found that Friday afternoons are not the most productive time. And there's a lot of research that's been done that shows that the kind of time that people on average stop being productive is about 2:30 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, because it starts to become admin or doing your online shopping, going to the pub, whatever it might be, and you brought your laptop with you. And so we found it very easy to transition into that 4.5-day week. And we've seen a lot of clients on Flexa that showcase their EDPs and their working environments. And they've also kind of started to dip their toes in the water with a 4.5-day week, because it feels less of a big change, I suppose, and less risky than implementing the full 4-day weeks. You've still got people working on a Friday morning, getting through things. So I don't know, if you've got an enormous amount of experience of kind of looking at that 4.5-day week, but I guess very broad question: what are your views on 4.5 versus 4?
Sure. I mean, I think work time reduction is a spectrum, and it's not just all about the 4-day work week. We've worked with law firms where their leadership have come to us really excited about the idea of a 4-day work week. But when you start looking at their business, you find out people are on average working 50, 55, 60 hours a week in reality. So are you going to move that business to a 32-hour 4-day work week overnight? Probably not. And actually, in that case, it might be more about how do we find the efficiencies within the existing work structure so that people can actually finish their day at 5 or 6 o'clock instead of 7 or 8 o'clock. So I would say 4.5-day weeks and 9-day fortnights, for some businesses, they may be a step on the road to a 4-day work week. They help them to kind of get buy-in, to get confidence, and to start to move in that direction in a slightly less risky way, particularly for organizations that are working through significant workload pressures. They're also commonly deployed by organizations who might be a bit smaller, and therefore, they need 5-day service coverage, and they have less people to roster to maintain that coverage. So therefore, having something like a 9-day fortnight might make more sense, not just as a step on the road, but as the final solution for those types of organizations. So there's lots of different ways to do it. And I think that the key conversation here is about the productive capacity and the technological tools that we have at our disposal to start moving the needle in the direction of reduced work time. That's going to look different for every business.
Yeah, very true. And obviously the 9-day fortnight, I think, was taken as another adaptation of that, so in order to give that full day off, but at a like less frequent, obviously. And when we look into the Evolve Work Week and kind of search preferences and candidate preferences on Flexa, so obviously probably back 5 years ago, the 4-day week was much less common, or 4.5-day week, 9-day fortnight, all of those things, let's call it the Evolved Work Week, was much less common than it is now. I think that's particularly as the pandemic has forced us to rethink, what work really is and what's productive and what isn't. Like commuting time every day, is it that productive? Probably not. And there are various different, ways that we can do exactly what you were saying there and think about inefficiencies and think about productive time. So I thought it'd be interesting to share with our audience the kind of differences in demand for the 4-day week versus 4.5-day week versus 9-day fortnight. Because naturally, one of the upsides of offering an Evolved Work Week is that you become much more attractive to talent, because you either get that 3-day weekend, 3.5-day weekend, or every other weekend is 3 days long, which is huge. Particularly when we think about flexibility, bringing work-life balance or work-life integration, as I prefer to call it. So of people who selected their kind of benefits and working environment preferences on Flexa, so we've got about 2.5 million users, and many of them choose to give us their preferences as to what kind of companies they'd like to work for. 45% of people said that they would love to work a 4-day week, probably unsurprisingly. I feel like a lot, even weren't expecting that to be a small number. And then secondly, actually, I think this is very interesting, is how close actually the demand for the 4.5-day week is. So 34% of people said that they would love a 4.5-day week. I personally found that quite surprising, because I would have thought that the difference between those two things, because you get an extra half day off a week for the same pay, I thought the difference in demand for those two things would be greater. But I suppose it's all about the experience of work that people have had and whether they think they'd be able to juggle their workload in that time. It's all very subjective. And then the third most in demand was the 9-day fortnight, which sits at around 11% of people saying that they would like a 9-day fortnight over those other two things. So interesting kind of demand statistics, which shows that about 95% of people would love some form of evolved work week, which is absolutely huge.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. COVID was the game changer. When I first started talking about this issue 5 or 6 years ago, most people, as you know, I'm from Ireland, most people thought this was a pie in the sky fantasy. I think COVID did two things. It opened the minds of employers to new ways of working. I think it caused a lot of people, from an employee perspective, to realign their priorities and the things that really matter to them in life. And I feel like, if you look at demand across the economy for greater time flexibility, it is greatest amongst Gen Z and younger generations of employees, which would suggest, I think, the demand curve is only heading in one direction. So this is, I think, a really compelling opportunity for organizations who recognize the future of work is probably not going to be about, hustling harder, working longer, showing up for longer, doing more stuff. It's going to be about leveraging technology to find efficiencies, sharing the benefits of those efficiencies with your employees in the form of time and greater quality of life. And therefore, as you say, leveraging a more attractive employee value proposition. So really positioning yourself at the cutting edge of both talent and technology. So it is something, I think, it's still, it's not as niche as it was 4 or 5 years ago, but I still think that this is something that is relatively novel in most industries and can really help, to give you an edge when it comes to attracting and retaining the best talent. And I think, there's, for some organizations that maybe can't pay top dollar in terms of salary, or even for some organizations who maybe, because of the type of work that they do, they can't offer, the same volume of work from home or location flexibility as potentially other industries or other organizations. This is a very compelling, creative way and an alternative to become more competitive.
Exactly that. And, I've seen it a lot in different companies where they've done that on a case by case basis as well, where there might be somebody that they can't quite afford, but they really want, so they'll put on a 4-day week for that kind of salary in order to, as you say, not be able to pay those top salaries, but you can still get top talent. And then when you've made those kind of steps with a few different people, then maybe it becomes culturally more the norm. I think also that's a great kind of segue into the effects on diversity within workforces of having reduced work hours. So naturally, when we've looked at, I guess, the more traditional alternative working patterns, so part-time or compressed hours or job shares, it's absolutely no secret about the impact that can have on gender diversity in organizations and enabling women to be able to work in meaningful employment, gainful employment. But I think what's really exciting is this idea of the Evolve Work Week becoming normalized. So it's not just that there are a few women in an organization that are on part-time that enables them to work, but actually that the whole working environment of a company is shifted and adapted to be more inclusive and therefore level the playing field. So you've got women that can work 4 days a week, spend more time with their family, spend less on childcare. And also, if you've got a 4-day week within your organization, it means that men can spend more time with their family, do more of the household chores, because it's sadly still the case that women do shoulder the burden of the majority of childcare and household chores as well. So I think the potential for this shift towards a more evolved and reduced hours work week can have a massive impact on gender diversity in particular.
Absolutely. I shared this with you on LinkedIn, Molly, but I first got interested in this topic based on some research that I was doing in Ireland in the Irish Public Service, looking at working hours, work-life balance, childcare, a whole host of related issues. And we discovered that we had a lot of working parents, predominantly women, who were already working 4-day weeks or some form of reduced hours. They had done so voluntarily for a reduction in salary, very common coming back off maternity leave. But when we started looking at the underlying performance data and having conversations with their managers, with the employees themselves, we found in most cases the job responsibilities were the same as when they were working 5 days, and their productive output was the same as their 5-day colleagues. So I think that that really shows that this idea of Parkinson's law, that a task expands to fill the time that's available for its completion, that holds true in a lot of modern organizations. And that absolutely this could be a real game changer, universalizing shorter work weeks when you think about career progression and leadership development, barriers and obstacles in organizations, when you think about that disparity in terms of domestic and caring responsibilities in the home. It could really be a game changer. And the phenomenal thing is, for an individual to move to a 4-day work week within a team, that is a harder thing to do than to do it across the team. Because if you think about the big inefficiencies, things like overlong and unnecessary meetings, distractions and interruptions in the workday, poor use of technology, outdated processes, no one person has the agency to change any of those things on their own. So the working parents that have been doing this on their own effectively have been doing it without that kind of collective effort to actually find those efficiencies. So I think that that demonstrates that the potential for this is immense.
Absolutely. And I think also from a diversity perspective, people with disabilities and chronic conditions is also an absolutely huge, it's a game changer. So a lot of people, if you follow me on LinkedIn, then you'd know the story of why we started Flexa. And it was because of the fact that I have an autoimmune disease that means that I'm technically classified as disabled, and it means that sometimes I can't walk. And back when I stupidly chose to go into investment banking, which is not very flexible, back then I couldn't walk about once a week. And so I kind of looked at my options after they let me go because of that. And I thought, well, one of the things that I could do is work 4 days a week, because it would mean that on the day where I'm unable to walk, that's the day that I don't go into the office, and then I otherwise work 4 days. But asking for that was even more difficult than pre-pandemic asking for any form of flexibility. And I thought I'd maybe found a solution that would make sense. So I do totally understand that perspective of what you said before about, as one individual, it's very difficult to make any changes or make it seem like it's actually possible. But what I do think is very exciting now is by reducing work hours for people with disabilities and conditions, obviously, often it's a lot more effort to get into the office. It's much more exhausting to do the work that a normal able-bodied person might be able to do, or at least I've definitely found that. So you really have to be super vigilant about what your really productive tasks are. You're kind of naturally, as an individual, weeding out those inefficiencies because it's not sustainable for you to do them. Right. So I think it's potentially a real game changer for individuals with disabilities and conditions, of being able to, is normalized again, working those 4-day weeks, those 4.5-day weeks, those 9-day fortnights, because it means that the amount of time that is spent working is reduced, but you're still getting just as much done. So you can spend more time on self-care, on sleep, on rest, on doing the things that are going to make you better, or just be able to deal with your condition. So I think that there's a lot of underlying benefit for all sorts of minority, or I should never refer to women as a minority group, but diverse groups.
Yeah, and I mean, to your point, Molly, interestingly, when we've seen organizations or teams that have adopted much more discretionary, flexible models around utilizing the day off, which isn't possible for every business or every team, but where there's a huge amount of employee choice in the day off. Mondays and Fridays, as I'm sure you could guess, are typically and very commonly the most popular. But where we've seen, a bit of a variance in that is among people with chronic health conditions, debilitating conditions, disabilities, where, the idea of breaking up the week, time off on a Wednesday, having those kind of two-day bursts, and that time to rest and recharge in the middle of the week is often something that's really appealing. So absolutely, I think this is something, the idea of leveraging a work environment where not just in terms of time off, but also structured work breaks and downtime within the workday is only going to be a good thing for people with disabilities, I think.
And fundamentally, it's making the kind of working environment overall more inclusive and leveling a playing field, so that I often talk about the concept of kind of othering people that need to work flexibly, whether it's people with disabilities, working mothers. You kind of, everyone else is working normally 5 days a week in the office as it was pre-pandemic, or now probably 3 days a week in the office, 2 at home. A bit more of a kind of hybrid approach has become normal. And the trouble with then saying, oh, well, these people can work a 4-day week, or these people can work flexible hours, or this person can work part-time, is then that's seen as that's not the norm. So they're therefore othered, you know, much more likely to be passed over for promotion, or much more likely to be seen as potentially underperforming or being a liability, or being less committed as well to their role because they need different working patterns. So I'm a huge advocate of companies adopting company-wide approaches, such as within a 4-day week or 4.5-day week, or overall flexibility, because it means that everybody has a level playing field and they're not competing against each other as to who can work in the most committed seeming way.
Right.
It just means that it's much more sustainable for those who may not thrive in traditional working environments.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a huge part of intent-based leadership is about looking at productivity through a people-first lens. And I think often we still have this issue. I think it's getting better, but we still have this issue where we think about things like employee well-being and burnout as kind of individual challenges rather than corporate challenges. There was recently some research done, a global survey on the state of workplace burnout, that found that 41% of people working 40-hour standard work weeks were experiencing burnout. Only 9% of people in reduced hour work environments. So I think if you're a leader and you're thinking about, how do I unlock capacity and productivity in my organization, finding a way to overcome the challenge of burnout for a third, that's what we're talking about, 41 down to 9, a third of your organization. That's probably the single biggest thing that you could do to improve your business's productivity. So I really think thinking about productivity and well-being, as complementary rather than competing forces is a really, really important part of the future of work.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And it's a conversation that I think is getting much more attention. Whereas before it was sort of well-being, rest, sleep, downtime, I think was seen as more of a weakness and potentially a lack of commitment to work, rather than actually being seen, to your point, as a complementary force. Another kind of question that I've been thinking of a lot recently, and I've had a few questions from our clients that are thinking about potentially moving from a 5-day week to a 4-day week, or 4.5 to 4, is I think people would love some sort of slam dunk facts, some measurable stats around the productivity impacts, the well-being impacts, all of the interesting findings that you've seen on the benefits of reduced hours work week, in terms of, well-being, productivity, etc. So if you've got any interesting ones to share.
Sure. I think that probably the most slam dunk statistic from the two major global trials I was involved in, the large one in the UK and the large one here in North America, 102 companies, 95 businesses at the end of the 6-month coordinated trial decided to stick with their reduced work time policy, which I think in and of itself is an extraordinary reflection of the success that they experienced. Those businesses saw a year-on-year increase in revenue of about 15%. And I'm pointing that out not to say that reduced work time caused their revenue to go up. I'm not saying that these things are directly correlated, but I think it does demonstrate that these are growing, successful businesses who have managed to do that with a backdrop of reduced work time. I think it won't surprise many people to learn that, employees typically in these trials were happier, healthier, improvements in their scores around burnout, mental health, life satisfaction. Businesses were finding it easier to attract and retain talent. And also, really interestingly, to the discussion that we had earlier, we asked employees, now that you've had the experience of working a 4-day work week, what would it take to entice you to go back to 5 days from a monetary compensation perspective? 45% of people said it would take a pay rise of more than 25%. And we had 15% of people who said that no amount of money would persuade them to go back to working 5 days. So I think that, when you think about this in terms of long term, businesses that maybe can't offer 4, 5, 6% pay increases every year, you can probably be competitive offering 2 or 3% if you're also doing something like a shorter work week.
Really interesting. Were there any employees that said that they didn't want to work the 4-day work week anymore, that they wanted to go back to 5?
Yeah, you definitely do see that. You definitely do see that in organizations. And we always recommend that if you're doing a pilot, everyone should take part in the pilot because it's really important to have that collectivism where everyone is engaged in the process of finding ideas, finding solutions, finding ways to make the business better. I don't believe that you should get to opt out of that endeavor. However, if at the end of the pilot, we always say, if you're adopting this, like most companies that have done this have not adopted this as a contractual change. They've adopted this as a policy change. And so I think offering people that opportunity to opt out, if you're somebody that likes to work on a Friday because of, norms, because of social connection, because of whatever the reason might be, if you to do that, the likelihood is the needle will have moved on the number of hours that you're requiring to put in every week because your Fridays are going to be decluttered. Your Fridays are going to enable you to have focused time. And we've
Yep.
often heard businesses, particularly at a leadership level, where they say moving to a 4-day work week as a business has meant that we're still probably working a lot of that fifth day, but we are protecting our evenings and our weekends because the stuff that we used to do late in the evening or on a Sunday evening to catch up, we're now getting the time on a Friday. I think it's not thinking about this in a really rigid way, but thinking about this in terms of what's the overall impact in terms of workload and work expectations.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and I could completely agree with that point of as leadership teams, like the fifth day you might still be working, like our Friday afternoons we're often still working, but it's quiet focus, the stuff that you would often have to catch up on a Sunday afternoon or a Saturday morning or whenever it might be. So it definitely helps you to be more structured and efficient within your week and protect that downtime. Really interesting stuff. And I guess, on the kind of flip side of all of those positives and the increase in productivity, the fact that businesses have still managed to grow their revenue while doing a 4-day week, what are some of the sort of cautionary tales that you've seen, like the pitfalls that companies really need to watch out for? You obviously mentioned about not enabling people to kind of opt out of the pilots, making sure that it's been kind of bottom up and everybody gets involved in those discussions. What other things have you kind of commonly seen done badly?
Yeah, I mean, the most common one is the kind of light switch effect where there's no proper planning, structure, intentionality behind how the process is designed. It's, a CEO wakes up one morning with a brilliant idea and the business has moved to the 4-day work week that Friday. I've seen examples of those eventually working, but as I said earlier, I think that the failure rate is probably higher and the process of getting there is probably more painful. I think that another one is, C-suite leadership teams thinking that all of the solutions rest around the executive table rather than having that bottom-up democratic process of enabling their people to engage with, the most detail-oriented CEO in the world does not know the day-to-day intricacies of each of their employees' jobs well enough to tell them how they need to redesign them to accommodate a reduction in work time. I would say the panacea pitfall, thinking that a shorter work week is going to solve all of your problems. I would say probably the biggest cautionary tale is this will surface more problems than it solves in the first instance. This is more about showing you the pain points in your business so that you can fix them rather than being a magic wand that just washes all of those away. And it also doesn't fix a bad culture. So, shorter work weeks can complement strong, positive organizational cultures. But if you've got a problem with trust and you've got a problem with accountability within your business, you either need to address those first or you need to address those as part of your move to a shorter work week.
Yep.
It's not going to paper over those cracks. So we have seen some organizations that are purely doing this as kind of a branding and a recruitment tool against the backdrop of that type of culture. And it doesn't work.
Yeah, it's gonna ultimately, you can't kind of paper over those cracks. Like we see it with so many other sort of flexible working measures. A lot of particularly CEOs tending to blame remote work for their culture dissolving or other cultural issues internally, whereas actually often, to your point, it exposes them. I think particularly remote working because managers have to manage much more intentionally. There's no ability to use presenteeism as a proxy for performance. Like everything has to be much more intentional, much more thought through. You have to think of the inefficiencies. You have to treat your employees like people and get to know them and how they want to work if you can't see them at their desks all the time. And I think that's exactly the same with moving to an evolved work week, because you have to kind of battle with the idea that the 4-day week or a 4.5-day week means that people are going to be working less hard, whereas actually it's about changing people's perceptions on what productivity really is.
Right.
And I think another, and I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, I'm sure you know this study better than I do, but the amount of actual productive time within a working day is significantly lower than the actual length of a working day. For the average person, it's somewhere between 4 and 6 hours versus your sort of 8 to 12-hour days that you'll often do in corporate environments. So there's obviously a lot of inefficiency and dead time there.
Yeah, I mean, the organizational science is pretty clear. 5 to 6 hours is kind of people's productive capacity.
Yeah.
There's been a number of studies, including from Harvard, that suggest that people are actually only productive for just under 3 hours in a workday in terms of actual value-adding work. And we saw some similar figures coming out from Slack recently. They did a major global survey of desk workers where they found, desk workers were saying on average that 41% of their time was being spent on low value or no value adding tasks or repetitive tasks. So, I think that reality is only going to accentuate with what's coming down the tracks in terms of AI and automation. The future is going to be less about busy work and more about outcomes-based work. And I think you're right, Molly, that you hear a lot of the same argument against this as you hear against remote work, where the things that you need to make this work are you need to measure by outcomes, you need to be able to get asynchronous communications right, you need to have a culture of trust, autonomy, accountability. So often the objections are more about a leader's idea of what work should be rather than the reality of what work actually is today in your organization.
Yeah, definitely. We've got quite a few questions piling up. So before we move on to questions, I think a great way to finish off would be, so obviously lots of our listeners here are probably thinking about the 4-day week, 4.5-day week. How would you advise people to kind of broach the topic of moving to a shorter work week, potentially building a business case in order to suggest a pilot, for example?
I think the first thing is to get a sense for what your business, what are they trying to solve for in terms of their challenges? Is it a lever to drive innovation, engagement, and productivity? Is it a tool to solve well-being and burnout challenges? Is it an opportunity to differentiate their talent proposition? I think being willing to talk about productivity in a way that it's not a dirty word, I think is important. I think being open to the fact that this is something that needs to be measurable, that this is something that needs to be conditional on performance. So almost arriving at the conversation, with that openness to that form of structure. I think coming to the table with suggestions and ideas for, if we were to try this, here are some areas that I think we could actually attack or address in order to become more efficient. I think the biggest thing is often the kinds of objections you hear against this tend to be very vague and very broad. So how do you force those very vague objections to become much more specific concerns? Because once you know what the specific concerns are, you're much better positioned to be able to kind of, address those systematically. So getting away from, as we talked about earlier, this idea that it's something that, ideologically a leader is uncomfortable with. Well, actually, what are the things, the things that matter to a business are the same whether you're working 5 days, 4 days, 4.5 days. So really getting the conversation down to those brass tacks, I think, is really important.
Yeah, that's really, really, really good advice. As you say, it's often a vague, oh no, I don't like the sound of that, or oh no, that won't work for us. But what does that actually mean? It's a very similar conversation to what a lot of people have around flexibility and implementing more flexible working. So we've got about seven different questions. Before we kind of dig into those, you mentioned there about what kind of challenge the 4-day week or 4.5-day week might be trying to solve. And so one thing that we've done for this webinar is obviously if it's a talent attraction or retention issue, is understanding like how competitive our listeners' EVPs are, so employer value propositions, against the market. So we've compiled loads of different data points to enable you to benchmark your working environment, whether that does or doesn't include Evolve Workweek, against the market. So you can see, are you in the top 20% of companies when it comes to a talent attraction perspective? So if anybody listening is interested in taking that little, it's like a 90-second quiz, there's a little banner at the bottom that says click to benchmark your working environment. That also might then give you some good statistics if one of your objectives of potentially implementing an Evolve Workweek is to improve your EVP or your talent attraction power. Might give you some nice stats in order to be able to do that. So lots of great questions. Our most upvoted one, which we'll tackle first, is about annual leave entitlement, which I think is a really sensible question. Seen quite a few different companies do it in different ways, but what would you suggest happens to annual leave entitlement?
I think it depends on the baseline, Molly. If you're an organization that's offering statutory annual leave, that's going to be different to an organization that currently offers a very generous annual leave entitlement well above statutory. And even that differentiates where, if you take here in North America, typically vacation days are less of a factor because they're so bad compared to Europe. I think that the most common one that to me makes sense is if you're an organization that's offering, let's say, 25 days of annual leave entitlement, that effectively equates to 5 weeks time off. I think it's perfectly reasonable to say if we move to a 4-day work week, we adjust that to 20 days, which is still the equivalent of 5 days off, again, with the 4-day baseline. So you kind of adjust it pro rata. But I think it really comes down to business needs. If adopting a 4-day work week with your current annual leave entitlement is going to cause, operational and service level issues within teams, then you probably need to do something to adjust that. I wouldn't change it just for the sake of, well, we're giving you this nice thing, so we have to do something less nice over here. It needs to be grounded in a justification that's based on business needs, I would say.
Yeah, and I think also to your point, if there are just some things that make sense, and I don't think it needs to be massively overcomplicated. Like, so at Flexo, we offer a lot of annual leave as well. I think it's in total, including bank holidays, it's between 43 and 45 days a year. We also have a 4.5-day week. How do we if we were saying that Friday half day is just half a day of annual leave, then we'd have people off all the time. So what we say is that if you're taking Friday, that counts as a full day of holiday, which then helps us to manage, rather than people taking every Friday off for the whole year or various different things like that when we have so much annual leave as well as a 4.5-day week. And I know some companies also treat it quite similarly, whereas if you've got that whole week off, then Friday will count, for example. So there's lots of different ways that you can do it. But to your point, it feels like there's only really an adjustment that needs to be made if your annual leave entitlement is quite generous. And so therefore it will actually start to have an impact on providing a service or being able to do that role. So the second most upvoted one is actually really interesting as well, logistically. So how do you manage moving to a 4-day working week with no change in pay when you already have employees who've made flexible working requests with a reduction in pay? So it might be that there are people already working 3 days or working 4 days, and then the whole business moves to that. How should that be handled?
Sure. So the most common ways that we've seen effectively part-time work, so people who are already working reduced hours, dealt with is either in a similar fashion to annual leave, in that you effectively make a pro rata adjustment. So in other words, you've got somebody who's currently working 20 hours a week, your business is working 40, you implement a 4-day work week to come down, the full-time hours comes down to 32. In that scenario, the person that's working 20 hours might come down to 16. The other most common one, and this is very typical, where you already have employees who are working 4 days and they're in that category, like we discussed earlier with the working parents, where they're working 4 days because they need to for their own out of work commitments. But in effect, their expectations and their productivity and their engagement with your team's work is the equivalent of a full-time employee. So in that scenario, you might equalize their salary, so they effectively come up to the full-time salary. And we've seen some scenarios where you offer employees the choice, because some people are working part-time or reduced hours because they want equivalent reduction in level of responsibility and workload. Other people are doing it because they need to do it to accommodate childcare, other caring responsibilities. So I think where possible, actually having that conversation with employees to say, in this scenario, would you prefer to become a full-time employee, or would you prefer to kind of continue to have that adjustment made as a more part-time member of the workforce? I think is useful.
Yeah, it seems like the kind of common theme that's coming through is like ultimately it makes sense to speak to your employees and identify the best approach rather than it always being that top down directive, which I totally agree makes sense. There are very differing reasons for people wanting to work part-time or different hours, and it can be circumstance, but it can also be a desire to not be a full-time employee, which is also completely fair. I think that's a great advice and great approach in order to tackle that. So another question is, a key driver for change is measurable results. So what are your tips for measuring the impact of trialing an evolved work week in a pilot?
Sure. So again, it depends on what you're trying to solve for. I would start with that. But and we typically will work with organizations to identify red lines and green lines. So green lines are what are the things that we're trying to achieve. Typically, organizations aren't moving to a shorter work week to stand still. So there are proactive things that they're trying to achieve or change. But there's also red lines. There's things that you don't want to compromise on. So things like customer service standards, for example. So we would always recommend to come up with a framework that encapsulates employee outcomes. So looking at things like well-being, sick leave, absenteeism, attrition and turnover, kind of customer outcomes. So, customer satisfaction, having that really open, transparent communication and dialogue with your clients and customers to ensure that this is landing in a way that works for them. And then business outcomes. And a really obvious one is things like revenue. The one area where there is no one metric that you can kind of apply across different organizations and industries is productivity. It's going to look different depending on your business. It probably is going to look different depending on your team within a business. So that's something that really needs to be, carefully designed. However, lots of companies make the mistake of thinking if we want to do a 4-day work week or a evolved work week, we need to come up with this super sophisticated, convoluted, new way of measuring productivity. The reality is, as I said earlier, the same things matter, no matter how many hours or days that you're working. So, if you've already got a good way of assessing business success, stick with that. It's going to be more comparative anyway. If you feel like you need to sharpen the way that you measure, then this might be an opportunity to do that.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And as companies also have moved towards more distributed or flexible working, naturally, there's had to have been a shift towards much more output-driven performance measurements, which naturally will go hand in hand with measuring the impacts that a 4-day week has. Because if you're already measuring employee performance and overall business performance through various different KPIs or OKRs, and it's not just about people sitting at their desks and seemingly doing a good job, and it's much more measured on revenue generation or users to site or various, obviously some roles are much easier to measure than others, but hopefully a lot of the hard work has already been done by moving to more flexible working over the last 4 years. So it should therefore hopefully make it easier to measure the impacts of a 4-day week now than it would have been 5 years ago. So another couple of questions that we've got, lots coming in actually, is have you seen any negative ramifications on external relationships, like client relationships, shareholders, etc., for organizations moving to a 4-day week?
I would say, funnily enough, shareholders are in a way easier to manage than organizations that I've seen try to do this in the public sector or in the nonprofit world. At the end of the day, if you can demonstrate that this works for the bottom line and this works for business growth and profitability, I feel like it's a conversation that is maybe a little bit easier to have with shareholders. I have seen some examples of private equity-owned businesses who have successfully adopted shorter work weeks. All of the measurable data-driven outcomes are clearly pointing to the fact that this has been working well, but they get bought out by somebody else and they just don't like it. So they end up moving back. On the customer side, I would say, and this is not me saying that this isn't a really important thing that you need to carefully manage and plan for. The fear of client and customer backlash tends to be much greater than the reality. So this is something that, I could probably count on one hand the amount of clients that I know who have lost a customer or a client explicitly because they don't like that they work a shorter work week. I would say the most common thing that we see from customers and clients is kind of intrigue and fascination, where this is something they've heard of, this is something that they're interested in, and they want to kind of follow the journey rather than this is something that makes them uncomfortable. I think that's changed. You can see that's changed so much in the last 4 or 5 years. Lots of the businesses that I worked with 4 or 5 years ago were doing this cloak and dagger. I think now you can see, business moves to a 4-day work week. They are typically shouting about it on LinkedIn. I think that just demonstrates how the context in this area has really shifted.
Yeah, and I think also to come back to some advice that you gave before, I think with shareholders or external stakeholders generally, a lot of their objections are going to be based around the kind of stigma of a 4-day week, meaning less work is done. So if they're saying things like, it shouldn't be done this way, or it won't work for your organization, then trying to drill down into exactly why they're saying that and what they are afraid of as a negative impact. Because obviously South Cambridgeshire Council has been in the spotlight for the fact that they've been doing a 4-day week, and now their MP does not want them to anymore, with seemingly very little evidence as to why, apart from the fact that it's a stigma that they'll be working less hard. So I think it's very important to drill into the reasons that those people care so much about what's happening and try to provide evidence that actually what they're afraid of is not the case.
It's a real challenge in public sector environments where this becomes a political tool. We've seen it happen all over the world. South Cambridgeshire is not the first instance of this. So yeah, if it was up to me, I would much rather convince my shareholders than try to convince the Taxpayers Alliance while they're standing outside the door with picket signs. It's a much more charged, politicized environment. Last piece of advice on this, I would say, for customers, align what you're trying to achieve as a business with the things that matter to them. So one really big benefit we've seen of this in professional services is that your turnover may go down means that, a big thing, if you're using a marketing agency or a law firm or an accountant, having that continued relationship is so important. So if you're able to say, we're trying to do this because we want to make sure that we can continue to provide that level of continuity to our clients, I think that's something that most clients are pretty receptive to.
Yeah, I think that's really, really super advice. And again, points to, what's the reason for wanting to do this? And then it becomes much easier to explain the rationale. So another question is around, at what point would you put the Evolve work week into a contract? They do a 9-day fortnight, but it's not contractual yet. I mean, for us, it was also not contractual. It's in our company handbook, and it's very much based on as long as there is no, incredibly urgent work. And I think in the 4 years that we've been running Flexo with a 4.5-day week, we've maybe had 3 Friday afternoons where that has been the case, and there's been something that's happened that has meant that a few people that would normally be off on a Friday afternoon have had to work. So, but we haven't put it into contracts yet because as a startup, it is helpful for us to have that sort of movability and sort of leeway around it. And we would also not want to be in a position where we would roll it back. But obviously, as to our point, you have to be flexible. So I think for us, it's not the right time to do it. And I know for a lot of startups, it's also the case. But to the point and the discussion that we've been having for the past while, I think it's very dependent on the type of organization that you are and what your objectives are.
Yeah, I mean, there's 3 different levels of, enshrining this in permanence. There's pilot, policy, and contract. I've worked with organizations who have been in almost perpetual rolling pilots for 4 or 5 years. I've worked with organizations who have made this permanent as a policy change, and then some who have adjusted contracts. The one cautionary note that I would give about contracts is that, number one, there tends to be a lot more knock-on unintended consequences around pension entitlements, annual leave that you need to navigate. So, absolutely consulting with an employment lawyer before you go down that road is really important. But I would also say that, to your point, Molly, even if there's no intention of ever rolling it back, I think the positive tension around the conditionality and the expectations of this, that this is a benefit that is earned rather than is a right, is actually really important. And I think we may get to a day, and I hope we get to a day in the next 5 years, 10 years or whatever, where this is common enough that, effectively to be a 4-day work week company is very routine. That's not the case today. To be a 4-day work week company in a 5-day week world where most of your clients, your competitors, your stakeholders, that's a heavy lift and it's hard work. And I think for that reason, having that degree of conditionality is probably not a bad thing, I would argue.
Completely agree with that. I think that's a great way of putting it, in the sense that it's not just a given. It does have to be earned. Things that you have to still be able to show that the organization is just as productive, that revenue is still growing, that there is no downside to the 4-day week. So we've got 2 more questions. So this one comes in. They're saying, I work at a large organisation that is due to pilot the 4-day week in a couple of months, with about 10% of the company to begin with. And this person is head of a team that has been picked to pilot it. Do you have any advice on major areas that come up as productivity savers when planning for this, aside from the commute and the tech tools that you already mentioned? And I'd also add meetings in there as well. Meeting culture is the death of productivity.
Absolutely. And multitasking is the enemy of productivity. So many of us think that we're good at it. The reality in the science is that there are very few people who are able to do 2 things at once to the same standard. So a big part of this transition is about identifying, task switching, flow disruption. How can we really curtail those behaviors and those phenomenons within our organization? In short, I would probably need to know more about the industry your business is in, the type of team that you're overseeing, to be able to answer this in a meaningful way. I think we've talked about some of the big buckets: meetings, distractions, technology, which isn't here's this flashy new tool to solve our problems, but is often how do we use our existing technologies in a more streamlined, integrated, consistent way. Process improvement, identifying where are the bottlenecks, where is the rework, where's the inefficiency. But yeah, we'd be happy to follow up the conversation with you if you want to reach out.
Awesome, thank you. And our final question, just in time, actually. It's actually the same as one before. So it's about how you would manage holiday for the 4-day week, when they've got some people doing a 4-day week with compressed hours, and other people on a 4-day week trial, etc. So again, it's about, do you need to reduce it? Although I suppose this is a little bit different, because it's about equaling it out for those that are part-time and those that are on a 4-day week trial. But I guess the same approach would probably stand.
Yeah, and I mean, a part of this again is are you trialing it in one area with a view to inform a policy that will expand to cover the whole organization? Because I think if that's the case, positioning this very much as an experiment, you're not, if you're doing an experiment in one part of the business, you're not going to achieve pure alignment and pure equality. So it is about, really positioning this as this is a temporary thing to learn from, so we can then come up with a solution that will cover everybody. But again, would probably need to know a little bit more about the details and the intricacies of that.
Awesome. Well, those were some really brilliant, really engaged questions from the audience, and hopefully we managed to answer most of them. Joe, thank you so much for joining us. You've been a wealth of knowledge. It's been really helpful, I think, for everybody listening to be able to work through probably some of the things that have been in their heads that they're trying to, how do you make a business case for it? How do you prove that it's been a success? Because I think it's something that a lot of individuals and companies are really striving to get towards, but definitely from our discussion over the last hour, you can tell it's not particularly simple, and there's lots of things to really think about. But I think the one kind of big takeaway that I've taken from this discussion is that you really have to understand why you're doing it, rather than just, I like the idea of a 4-day week or a 4.5-day week. What problem are you trying to solve, or what opportunity are you trying to give people?
Absolutely. It's hard, but if you get it right, it's totally worth it.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for your time. And everybody, feel free to follow either of us on LinkedIn, reach out with any other questions if anything comes to mind. And this recording will be available on demand via the same link as well. So feel free to share with anybody that you think would find it interesting. And thank you so much for joining.